The door to the second bedroom had not been opened in 5 years. Not once, not even to sweep the dust from the floorboards, and Timothy Doyle had made his peace with that, until the night Kate Brenner knocked on his front door in the rain and asked if she could stay just one night. The year was 1883, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat right along the southern border like a bead of sweat on a man's brow, dusty and restless, and full of people who had somewhere better to be. It was a cattle town, a whiskey town, a town where fortunes were made on the backs of longhorns and lost at the poker table before sunrise. The Kishom Trail still breathed through its streets, though its great heyday was beginning to fade the way all good things eventually do, quietly and without ceremony. The Texas cowboys still came through, trailing their cattle north, filling the saloons and the boarding houses and the makeshift corrals that stretched out beyond the edge of town. Caldwell had a newspaper, 2 churches that competed bitterly for souls, a general store run by a man named Abernathy who never smiled, and a modest collection of homesteads scattered along the surrounding prairie like seeds tossed carelessly from an open hand. Timothy Doyle's homestead sat about a mile east of town, close enough to hear the church bell on Sunday mornings if the wind was right, far enough that the noise of the saloons did not reach him at night. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from honest work rather than vanity, with dark hair that he cut himself and dark eyes that held more in them than he generally chose to say aloud. He had come to Caldwell 6 years prior from County Wicklow in Ireland by way of New York City, and then St. Louis, following the pull of land that a man could actually own, land that did not belong to a landlord who could put him out with a letter and a week's notice. He had built the house himself with the help of a Comanche man named Red Elk, who lived on the eastern edge of the territory, and who had traded his labor for a fair wage, and treated him with more dignity than most of the town ever extended in return. The house had 2 bedrooms, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen that was really just a corner of the main room with a wood stove, and a front porch that faced west so that Timothy could watch the sunsets without having to stand in the yard. The second bedroom had been his wife's room. Her name had been Clara, and she had died in the winter of 1878 from a fever that moved through the town with terrifying efficiency, taking 3 children, an elderly preacher, and Clara Doyle in the span of 10 days. She had been 26 years old, and she had made the curtains for that second bedroom herself from a bolt of yellow fabric she had ordered from a catalog, and she had been so pleased with how they turned out that she had hung them before the room was even properly finished. Timothy had not been able to bring himself to take them down after she was gone. He had closed the door and left everything exactly as it was, the yellow curtains, the iron frame bed with its quilt, the small wooden chair in the corner where Clara used to sit and read by lamplight in the evenings. He had simply closed the door and moved through his days without opening it. He was not a man given to dramatic grief. He worked his land, kept a small herd of cattle, sold them when the drovers came through, traded at Abernathy's store, attended church with reasonable consistency, and maintained a quiet life that the townspeople of Caldwell described as solitary but respectable. He was known for being fair-minded, for paying his debts on time, for not picking fights in the saloon even when the cowboys from Texas got loud and foolish after midnight. He was known, also, for not having brought another woman into his house in 5 years, which the women of Caldwell found alternately admirable and wasteful, depending on which one you asked. It was the second week of September when the rains came. They came the way rains come in Kansas in late summer, without much warning and with a great deal of conviction, turning the packed dirt streets of Caldwell into rivers of mud, and making the prairie smell like something ancient had just woken up. Timothy had spent the day mending a section of fence along the north side of his property, and had come inside just before the first clap of thunder, his boots already wet and his patience for the weather thoroughly depleted. He had made himself a meal of salt pork and cornbread, and had settled into the chair by the fireplace with a well-worn copy of a newspaper from 3 weeks prior, because that was often how news arrived in Caldwell, late and slightly crumpled. He heard the knock at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening. It was not a timid knock. It was deliberate, the kind of knock made by someone who has weighed the decision carefully and committed to it. He set down his newspaper and crossed to the door and opened it, and standing on his front porch in the rain was a woman he had never seen before, which was notable because Caldwell was not a large town, and he generally knew most faces in it. She was soaked through. Her dark hair was plastered to the sides of her face, and her coat, a respectable brown coat, he noted, not the kind of garment belonging to someone who worked in one of the saloons, was dripping steadily onto the porch boards. She was carrying a leather traveling bag that looked as though it had seen better days, and was looking at him with green eyes that held something he recognized immediately. Not helplessness exactly, but the particular exhaustion of a person who has been pushing through difficulty for longer than is reasonable, and has only just reached the edge of their endurance. "I am sorry to disturb you," she said, and her voice was clear and steady despite everything, despite the rain and the dark, and the fact that she was standing on a stranger's porch at 9 o'clock at night. "My name is Kate Brenner. I arrived in Caldwell this afternoon on the southbound stage, and the boarding house on Main Street is full. Mrs. Hatch at the general store told me you might be the sort of man who could help. I'm not asking for charity. I have money to pay. I'm only asking if you might have a spare room where I could stay just for one night, and I will be gone first thing in the morning." Timothy Doyle stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment that was longer than politeness strictly required. The firelight from inside the house fell across her face, and he could see that she was younger than he had first assumed, perhaps 24 or 25, and that beneath the exhaustion there was a quality to her that was difficult to name immediately, a kind of steadiness, a sense that she had not been defeated by whatever had brought her to this porch in the rain. "You spoke with Mrs. Hatch," he said. "She described you as a decent man," Kate said. "I am a decent woman. I would not ordinarily ask a stranger for this kind of favor, but I have run out of other options and it is raining very hard." He stepped back from the doorway. "Come inside, Miss Brenner," he said. She came in, dripping onto his floorboards, and he closed the door behind her against the rain and the wind. He brought her a towel from the trunk near the fireplace, and she thanked him with a kind of quiet dignity that made him think she was not accustomed to accepting help, and was making a determined effort to do so gracefully. He put the kettle on the wood stove, and she sat in the chair across from the fireplace and pushed her wet hair back from her face and looked around his house with an expression that was not intrusive, merely observant. "You live here alone?" she asked. "I do," he said. "It is a well-built house," she said. "Did you build it yourself?" "Most of it," he said. "A man named Red Elk helped me with the framing." She nodded as though this was a perfectly normal answer, which it was, though he had learned over years in Caldwell that some people received the mention of Red Elk with a different sort of expression, tight and disapproving. Kate Brenner's expression did not change at all, and he noted this. He made 2 cups of tea, which he had maintained the habit of from his years in Ireland, a fact that the cowboys and ranchers of Caldwell found mildly baffling. He brought one to her, and she wrapped both hands around it and breathed in the steam, and something in her shoulders descended slightly, the way tension does when warmth finally reaches it. "Where have you come from?" he asked, settling into his own chair across from her. "Fort Worth," she said. "Before that Memphis, before that Chicago." She looked at the fire. "I have been moving in the wrong direction for about 2 years. I am trying to correct it." "What is in Caldwell for you?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, not a suspicious one. She was quiet for a moment, and he did not press her. The fire crackled, and the rain beat against the windows, and the room was warm in the particular satisfying way that rooms are warm when the weather outside is making its worst argument. "I have a letter from a man named Garfield Prout," she said finally. "He is a rancher about 12 miles north of here. He wrote to an agency in Memphis that arranges employment contracts for women with household management experience. He is looking for a housekeeper. The letter described a wage and a private room and work that I am capable of doing. She looked at him then, directly and without apology. It is honest work and it is a fixed address, which is what I need at present. Garfield Prout, Timothy said, and something moved across his face that he adjusted quickly. I know him. Is he a reasonable man? Kate asked, and there was something in how she asked it that suggested she had made some inquiries already and was hoping his answer would settle a concern rather than confirm one. Timothy chose his words with some care. He is a man with a large ranch and strong opinions, he said. He has had several housekeepers over the past few years. None of them have stayed longer than a season. Kate looked at him steadily. Why is that? I could not say with any certainty, Timothy said, which was the honest truth, though he had his suspicions. Garfield Prout was 60 years old and owned more land than anyone in the county, and used both of these facts as though they constituted a kind of permission to behave however he liked. He was not a violent man, so far as Timothy knew, but he was demanding and dismissive, and paid his workers as though they should be grateful for the opportunity regardless of the wage. I see, Kate said, and he could tell she had heard something in what he had not said as clearly as in what he had. He showed her to the second bedroom. He stood at the door for a moment before he opened it, his hand on the latch, and something moved through his chest that was not precisely grief anymore, but was related to it the way a scar is related to the wound that made it. He opened the door. The room smelled of dust and disuse, as rooms do when they have been closed a long time, and the yellow curtains that Clara had made were still at the windows, faded somewhat but intact, and the quilt on the iron bed was still in place, and the small wooden chair was still in the corner. I apologize for the dust, he said. The room has not been used in some time. Kate looked at the yellow curtains and then at him, and she did not ask why the room had been closed or how long it had been that way. She simply said, "It is a lovely room. The curtains are beautiful." "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I will get you a fresh candle. The bedding should be clean enough, but I will change it if you prefer." "The bedding is fine," she said. "Mr. Doyle, you have been very kind. I will not trouble you further tonight." He brought her the candle and extra blankets and said good night, and closed the door behind him. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark, listening to the rain, and then he went to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed and thought about yellow curtains and a woman with green eyes who had looked at them and called them beautiful without knowing anything about them. He did not sleep well, but that was not unusual. In the morning she was already awake when he came through to start the fire in the wood stove. She was standing at the kitchen window in the gray early light, fully dressed, her traveling bag sitting near the front door. The rain had stopped and the world outside looked washed and new in the pale September morning. "You do not have to leave immediately," he said, because it was barely past 6 o'clock and the morning was cold and the road to Prout's ranch was muddy after the rain. "I will make breakfast." She turned from the window and looked at him with that same steady directness from the night before. "I do not want to impose," she said. "You are not imposing," he said. "Sit down." She sat at the table, and he made eggs from the chickens he kept in the yard and sliced bread that he had baked 2 days before, which was not as fresh as it might have been but was still acceptable, and he put them on the table with a pot of coffee that he had learned to make in America because tea was not always available on the frontier. She ate with the quiet appreciation of someone who has missed a few meals and is too well-mannered to say so. "When did you last eat?" he asked. She looked up. "Yesterday morning," she said. "The stage made poor time in the rain, and I did not want to spend money at the station stop when I did not know what I would need it for in Caldwell." "You should have said," he said. "I am saying now," she said, mildly but with a small edge of humor in it that surprised him. He looked at her and she was almost smiling just at the corner of her mouth, and he thought it was a very good corner of a mouth. He cleared his throat and looked at his eggs. "How old are you, Miss Brenner, if you do not mind my asking?" 25, she said. "And yourself?" 31, he said. though I feel older some mornings." "So do I," she said. After breakfast, he offered to drive her out to Prute's ranch in his wagon, since his fence work was done, and he had planned to go into town for supplies anyway, and the ranch road was in the same general direction. She accepted without making it into more than it was, a practical offer accepted practically, and he found this refreshing. He had known women in Caldwell who turned every small gesture into an elaborate social transaction, and it was exhausting. He hitched his horse, a sorrel gelding named Fletcher who had an excellent temperament and a bad habit of eating fences when he was bored, and Kate climbed up onto the wagon seat with the ease of a woman who had not spent her life being helped into things, and they set out along the road north of town through the wet and brilliant Kansas morning. It was beautiful out there in a way that was easy to forget when you lived inside it every day. The prairie stretched in every direction, gold and green under the new-washed sky, and the cottonwoods along the creek beds had begun to turn, their leaves going yellow at the edges, and the air smelled of wet earth and sage, and something sweet that Timothy had never been able to name precisely, but that he associated with September mornings on the high plains. Kate sat beside him on the wagon seat and looked at it all with the undisguised attention of someone seeing it for the first time. "It is bigger than I imagined," she said, "the sky especially." "It takes some adjustment," he said. "You are from Chicago originally." "Born in Boston," she said. "Went to Chicago with my husband 6 years ago." She paused and then said it cleanly and without drama, the way you say something that has been a fact long enough that the raw feeling of it has worn smooth. "He died 3 years ago. Railroad accident." "I am sorry," Timothy said. "He was a good man," she said. "His name was Frank. He died as he was, which was quickly and without much warning and in the middle of doing something practical." She almost smiled again. "I have been making my way since then, trying to find the right place to land." He nodded and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would be worth the saying, and after a moment she seemed to appreciate the silence. They reached Prute's ranch at mid-morning. It was an imposing operation. There was no other word for it, with a long white-painted house and several outbuildings and corrals full of cattle and cowboys moving purposefully around the yard. Garfield Prute himself came out onto the porch when the wagon pulled up, a heavy man with white side whiskers, and the bearing of a man who had been right about things so many times he had decided to skip the doubt. He looked at Kate with the assessing look of a man reviewing a purchase, and Timothy felt something tighten in his jaw. "Miss Brenner," Prute said, "you are a day late. The stage was delayed by rain, Mr. Prute," Kate said pleasantly, climbing down from the wagon before Timothy could offer a hand. "I trust the letter indicated the possibility of weather delays." Prute looked mildly surprised, as though he had expected a different register. "It did not," he said. "Then I apologize for the inconvenience," Kate said, and there was nothing in her tone that was apologetic in the slightest. She said it as a social formality and moved past it. "Shall we discuss the terms of employment you outlined in your letter?" Prute looked at Timothy. "Doyle," he said, as a form of acknowledgement that was barely one. "Prute," Timothy said in kind. Kate conducted her conversation with Prute with a composure that Timothy, watching from the wagon seat, found quietly remarkable. She asked clear questions about the duties, the hours, the wage, the accommodations. Prute answered in a way that was slightly evasive on the wage question, and Timothy watched Kate note this and file it and continue without making an issue of it in the moment, and he thought she was either very patient or very strategic, and suspected it was both. She looked back at him when she turned toward the house to be shown her room, just a glance, and in it was something he was not entirely sure how to read. It was not quite a question and not quite a farewell. It was the kind of look that means I am going to be all right, and also possibly, I hope I am going to be all right. He drove back to Caldwell thinking about it for most of the way. He did not see her again for 11 days. During those 11 days, he worked his land and sold 2 steers to a buyer from Wichita, and had a conversation with Red Elk when Red Elk came through to trade, and went to church on Sunday, where the Reverend Moss preached a sermon about patience that Timothy found more personally applicable than he was comfortable with. He traded at Abernathy's store and had a drink at the Occidental Saloon on Friday evening, where a group of Texas cowboys were making the usual Friday evening noise, and he talked to the blacksmith, Marcus Webb, about the price of iron. And through all of it, he was doing something he recognized after a few days as waiting, though he could not have said precisely what he was waiting for. On the 11th day, Kate Brenner appeared at his door in the late afternoon, and this time she was not soaking wet, and she was not on the edge of exhaustion. She was composed and neat and carrying a small basket and wearing the kind of expression that suggests a decision has been made after considerable deliberation. "I want to thank you properly for your kindness the other night," she said. "I brought you a pie. It is apple. There were apple trees on the north side of the Prout property, and Mrs. Colton, she is the cook, showed me where they were and let me use the kitchen." He took the pie and looked at it, and it was a very good-looking pie with a properly crimped crust, and he said, "You did not have to do this." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He invited her in and made coffee, and they sat at his table and ate slices of the pie, which was excellent, and they talked. It was easy to talk to her, which was a thing he noticed because it was not always easy for him. He talked a great deal in his head and considerably less out loud, which was a habit he had developed over 5 years of living alone. But Kate Brenner asked questions that were interesting and answered questions with answers that had actual content in them. And before he was quite aware of it, an hour had passed, and then another. She told him about Chicago and what it had been like in the years just after the fire, rebuilding and chaotic and full of energy that was equal parts ambition and desperation. She told him about Frank, more than she had in the wagon, and he could hear both the love and the grief in it settled into the same space the way they eventually do when enough time has passed. She told him she had worked as a schoolteacher in Memphis for a year and then as a bookkeeper for a merchant in Fort Worth, and that the merchant had retired and closed his business, which was why she had been looking for something new. He told her about Ireland, which he rarely talked about, and about the crossing, which had been difficult in ways that were mundane and in ways that were not, and about New York, which had been overwhelming, and St. Louis, which had been a relief, and about the morning he had come over the top of a rise and seen the Kansas prairie stretching out in front of him and felt for the first time since leaving Wicklow that he was standing in the right place. "Did you always want to be a cattleman?" she asked. "I always wanted land that was mine," he said. "The cattle are a practical extension of that. What I actually like doing is the building, the fencing, the framing, the repair work. I like fixing things. That is a useful thing to like," she said. "And you," he said, "what do you actually like doing?" She thought about this with genuine seriousness, as though it was a question she had not been asked in a while and was checking to make sure the answer was still accurate. "Teaching," she said. "I like teaching the children in Memphis very much, and reading, and baking, apparently." She looked at the remains of the pie. "Frank used to say that I could find a way to enjoy any task if I was given enough time with it." "He sounds like he knew you well," Timothy said. "He did," she said, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet and the September light was very golden through the window. "Not everyone gets that," she said. "I know that. I was fortunate." "So was he," Timothy said, and he had not intended it to come out quite like that, but it did. She looked at him, and her green eyes were very clear in the afternoon light, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Doyle," in a voice that was a little quieter than her usual one. He walked her to the road when she left, and she said she would walk back to the ranch. It was only a few miles, and the evening was fine, and he said the road could be rough after rain in the low places, and she said she had good boots, and they both knew this was not really about the road or the boots, and she walked away into the golden September evening while he stood at the end of his drive and watched her go and told himself to be sensible. She came back the following week, and the week after that. It became a pattern so gradual and natural that he was well inside it before he had thought carefully about whether he was entering it. She came on Thursday afternoons, which was her half-day from Prout's, and they talked and drank coffee, and sometimes she brought something from the Prout kitchen, preserves or bread, or once a jar of honey from a rancher who traded with Prout. And sometimes he had something from his own garden or his smokehouse, and they would sit at the table or on the porch, depending on the weather, and talk about everything and nothing. He began to notice specific things about her. The way she tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The way she laughed, which was sudden and genuine and slightly surprised, as though she had not been expecting to find something that funny and was pleased to discover she had. The way she looked at the prairie in the evenings with the same attention she gave to whatever he was saying to her, as though the world was interesting enough to merit being looked at carefully. He noticed that she read constantly, borrowing books from whoever would lend them, and that she had strong opinions about the books she read that she expressed with a precision and a confidence that delighted him. He noticed that she was unfailingly kind to people who deserved it, and refused to be condescended to by people who thought she did not. He also noticed, because he was not blind, and also because Marcus Webb at the blacksmith told him in October with the cheerful bluntness of a good friend, that 3 different men in Caldwell had become aware of Kate Brenner's existence and were making their interest known. One was the new bank clerk, a young man named Harrison who wore his hair with pomade and had more confidence than was warranted. One was a widowed rancher from the western side of the county named Cole, who was generally regarded as a decent sort, but who was 54 years old. And one was Red Elk's nephew, a young man of 20 named Thomas who rode into Caldwell on market days and who had apparently exchanged some conversation with Kate at Abernathy's store and found it memorable. "You want to know what people are saying," Marcus Webb said, looking at Timothy over the fence he was repairing in front of the smithy. "No," Timothy said. "They are saying that if you do not do something about it, Harrison from the bank is going to ask her to a church social, and she will probably say yes because she is not the sort of woman to sit still indefinitely waiting for a man who has not indicated that waiting is what she should be doing." Timothy looked at him. "You said a great deal more than I asked for," he said. "You did not ask me anything," Marcus said. "That is the problem." Timothy thought about this on the way home, and the honest truth of it settled in his chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending out rings that he could feel. He had been careful. He had been perhaps too careful in the way that men are careful when they are afraid that the feeling is bigger than they know how to hold without dropping something. He thought about Clara, which he always did when he thought about this. Not with guilt exactly, but with the question of whether moving forward constituted a kind of betrayal, which he knew intellectually it did not, and emotionally it did not quite leave him alone about. He sat by his fireplace and thought about it with the serious attention it deserved. Clara had been gone 5 years. She had been the most warmly practical person he had ever known, and he was fairly certain that if she could have communicated with him she would have said something along the lines of, "You are being very foolish, Timothy, and that is unlike you," which was something she had said to him twice in their marriage about other matters, and which had both times been entirely accurate. The following Thursday Kate arrived at his door in the middle of a burst of Indian summer warmth that October had unexpectedly produced, and she was wearing a dark blue dress he had not seen before, and her hair was pinned up with a care that was slightly more deliberate than usual, and he thought, "Here we are." They sat on the porch because the afternoon was warm enough for it, and the prairie was extraordinary in the October light, all bronze and gold under a sky so blue it seemed improbable, and Timothy said, without having quite planned the moment but feeling that waiting for a planned moment was exactly what had gotten him into this, "Kate, I would like to ask you something." She turned from looking at the prairie and looked at him, and he could not tell if she knew what was coming or not, because her expression was simply attentive. "I would like to take you to the church social on Saturday," he said. "Not as a matter of charity or neighborly goodwill, but as, I mean to say that I would like to take you as a man who would like to spend more time with you, and who is asking you directly because I find I cannot not say it any longer, and I would rather say it plainly than spend another 3 weeks not saying it." There was a silence that was not precisely uncomfortable, but that had a certain weight to it. "I have been wondering," Kate said, "whether you were going to say something." "How long have you been wondering?" he said. "Approximately 6 weeks," she said, and now she was smiling, that surprised, genuine smile, and he felt something in his chest unknot. "I should have said it sooner," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but I understand why you did not, and I am glad you did now." "Will you come to the social?" he said. "Yes," she said, "I will." He looked at her on his porch in the October sunshine, and he thought that he had not felt this particular combination of terrified and fortunate in a very long time, and that it was a good feeling, and that he had perhaps underestimated how much he had missed it. The church social was held on the Saturday in the yard of the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, which had the better yard of the two churches, and used this as a quiet, ongoing argument for its own superiority. There were long tables with food brought by the women of the congregation, and lanterns hung in the trees as the evening came on, and a fiddle player named Jonah, who was 60 years old and could play anything you hummed at him. Timothy collected Kate from the road at the edge of Pruitt's ranch in his wagon, which he had cleaned for the occasion, and she climbed up beside him in a green dress that he had not expected, and that matched her eyes so precisely it was almost architectural, as though she had built the dress around the eyes or the eyes around the dress. He said, "You look very fine, Kate," which was not as articulate as he would have liked but was entirely true. She said, "So do you, Timothy," and he was wearing his best shirt and the jacket he had bought in St. Louis and had worn only 4 times since, and he was glad he had bothered. They arrived at the social, and the effect was immediate and somewhat theatrical. The church social in Caldwell was the sort of event where the social arithmetic of the community became briefly visible: who was standing with whom, who was watching whom, what it meant. Harrison from the bank saw them arrive together, and his expression underwent a complicated adjustment that Timothy observed with a satisfaction he tried to keep proportionate. Several of the women of the congregation looked at Kate with the frankly evaluating attention of people assessing something they had heard about and are now seeing for the first time, which Kate received with perfect composure and a friendly manner that disarmed most of them within minutes. The Reverend Moss's wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Eleanor, who was generally considered the most authoritative social intelligence in town, came directly to them with the particular momentum of someone who had already decided how this conversation was going to go, and said to Kate, "Miss Brenner, I have heard a great deal about you. All good things, I assure you. Are you finding Caldwell agreeable?" "Very agreeable," Kate said warmly. "I have met a number of extremely kind people." Eleanor Moss looked at Timothy with an expression that was simultaneously approving and mildly accusatory, as though to say, "Finally," which Timothy received without comment. They ate and talked, and when Jonah struck up the fiddle, Timothy asked Kate to dance, which in 1883 in a Methodist churchyard was a thing done with a certain degree of social visibility and significance. She took his hand, and he was aware of her hand in his, with a sharpness of attention that he would not have expected from himself, and they moved through the simple reel that Jonah was playing, and she danced the way she did most things, competently and with pleasure, and he thought, "I have been standing in the wrong field, and the right one was only a mile away, and I almost talked myself out of walking across to it." After the dancing they stood at the edge of the lantern light where the yard gave way to the dark prairie, and the stars above Caldwell were extraordinary, as they always were when the air was clear, which was often. Kansas had the best sky for stars that Timothy had ever seen, and he had looked at it thousands of nights, but he looked at it now with Kate standing beside him, and it seemed to him that you needed the right person beside you to fully appreciate certain things. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "Stars," he said, "and about how strange it is that you had nowhere to sleep 11 weeks ago, and now here we are." She considered this. "It is strange," she said. "I knocked on your door expecting a simple answer to a practical problem, and instead I found," she paused, choosing the word, "something that I was not expecting to find anywhere." "What was that?" he said, though he thought he knew. "Someone to talk to," she said. "Someone who listens as though what you say matters. Someone who—" She stopped and looked at him, and the lamplight from the nearest lantern was very kind to them both. "I have been trying not to be foolish about this," she said. "I have been trying to be sensible." "So have I," he said. "I am not sure it is working for either of us." "No," she said. "I do not think it is." He walked her to the edge of the yard, and he said, "Kate." And she turned and looked at him, and he said, "I would like to see you as often as you will permit, and not only on Thursday afternoons. I am not very good at talking around things when I have thought them through clearly, so I will say it plainly. I think you are remarkable. I have thought so since you stood on my porch in the rain and asked for one night's lodging with the composure of someone who was doing me a small favor rather than asking for one. I would like to know if you feel anything in return that is worth pursuing." She was very still for a moment. The fiddle played behind them, and someone laughed in the crowd, and the October air moved gently and smelled of wood smoke and dry grass. "I feel a great deal in return," she said. "That is what I have been trying to be sensible about." He took her hand, there on the edge of the dark, and she let him, and her hand was warm and steady in his, and they stood like that for a moment that felt complete in itself, not a beginning exactly, though it was that too, but a recognition of something that had been building for 11 weeks and had now been acknowledged out loud. Driving her back to Pruitt's ranch afterward in the wagon, the horses moving slow under the massive stars, they talked quietly for the entire 3 miles, and the talking was different now, easier and more particular. The way conversation changes when you have told someone the truth and they have told it back. At the turnoff to the ranch road, she climbed down from the wagon and then turned and looked up at him and said, "Timothy, thank you for a lovely evening." "Thank you for coming," he said. "I will see you on Thursday," she said. "And Sunday," he said, "if you will allow me to take you to church." "I will allow you," she said, and that corner of her mouth turned up. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Timothy had experienced in a long time, which he acknowledged to himself with a mixture of gratitude and a kind of careful tenderness toward the feeling, as though it was something he did not want to hold too tightly in case the pressure broke it. He saw Kate twice weekly at minimum, on Sundays and Thursdays, and often on other days as well when circumstances permitted. He began stopping at Pruitt's ranch on his way into town to check if she needed anything from Abernathy's store, which was a transparent excuse that she accepted with equal transparency, and they both found this arrangement entirely satisfactory. He learned her in layers, the way you learn a person who does not give everything at once but gives it honestly when they give it. He learned that she had a genuine talent for organization that she applied to everything from recipe books to emotional problems, that she hated injustice with a quiet fury that occasionally surprised him with its intensity, that she read so widely and with such appetite that she was always slightly ahead of wherever he thought she was intellectually, and that this delighted rather than intimidated her when he pointed it out. He learned that she cried at things she thought no one was watching her cry at, small things sometimes, a pretty sunset, a story about someone's hardship, a dog that had been injured on the road being carried to safety. He learned this because he was watching her, not intrusively, but with the close attention of someone who is genuinely interested. She learned him too. She noticed that he went quiet when he was worried rather than talking more, as many people did. She noticed that he was meticulous about the welfare of his animals in a way that extended without effort to the people around him. She noticed that he was funny in a dry and unexpected way that emerged at the least predictable moments, and that when she laughed at it, he looked pleased in a way that he tried very quickly to moderate. She told him once that she had noticed this and he had given her a look of mild exasperation, and she had laughed and he had let himself laugh too. He told her about Clara in late October, properly, not the bare biographical facts he had offered in the wagon on the first morning, but the actual Clara, what she had been like, what their marriage had been, what it had been like to lose her. They were sitting on his porch in the last of the good weather, the evening turning cold in the way that Kansas evenings do in late October, dropping several degrees in the span of an hour, and he told her everything, and she listened without offering anything except her attention and her silence, which was exactly what was needed. When he finished, she said, "She sounded wonderful." "She was," he said. "She was the best version of what she was. Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Kate said. Frank was the same. He was fully himself, which is a rare thing. "It is," he said. "Do you think," Kate said carefully, not as a challenge but as a real question, "that loving someone before makes it harder or easier to love someone again?" He thought about this seriously. "I think it does both," he said. "It makes it harder because you know what it costs, and easier because you know what it is worth." She looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very honest answer," she said. "I am trying to be honest," he said. "With you especially," she nodded slowly. "So am I," she said. "And honestly, I have not felt this much like myself in a very long time. Since before Frank died, maybe longer." She looked at her hands in her lap. "Being around you makes me feel like the version of myself that I actually prefer." He reached over and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over so that they were palm to palm, and neither of them said anything further on the subject because nothing further was needed. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday afternoon in November, which was not Thursday or Sunday, and therefore not part of the routine. And this was because she had come by on her way back from town on an errand for Prout, and had stopped to tell him something funny that had happened at Abernathy's store, and they were standing in his yard in the watery November light, and she was laughing, and he thought he was simply not going to make it through the story without kissing her, and he did not. It was a good kiss, which was to say it was very honest and very warm, and she kissed him back with a certainty that removed any lingering uncertainty from the situation. And when it was over, they were both slightly quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I was wondering when you were going to do that as well." "How long?" he said. 3 weeks, she said. "I was trying to be appropriate," he said. "You have been very appropriate," she said. "Extremely appropriate, almost heroically appropriate." He kissed her again, and this one was less about wondering and more about knowing, and that was better still. November in Caldwell brought its characteristic combination of cold clarity and wind off the plains that could strip a hat from your head in an instant and replace your good humor with a grim determination to get inside. The cattle drives were done for the season, and the cowboys from Texas had gone home or gone to ground in the saloons and the boarding houses, and the town settled into its winter self, quieter and more purposeful. Timothy spent the mornings on necessary repairs to the homestead and the afternoons and evenings in the increasingly enjoyable company of Kate Brenner, and he found that his days had taken on a shape that they had lacked for several years, a shape defined by more than just the practical work of keeping a farm going. He also found, and this was something he had not fully anticipated, that the second bedroom no longer carried the same weight it had. He passed its door daily now without the specific heaviness that had collected around it over 5 years. It had become, again, simply a room in a house. The yellow curtains were still there, and he still noticed them sometimes with a pang that was soft and familiar rather than sharp, and he thought that this was what healing looked like when it happened gradually and honestly, not the erasure of what was before, but the incorporation of it into something larger. He began talking to Kate about the future, in the way you do when you have allowed yourself to believe the future is going to include someone. He talked about his plans for the homestead, a bigger barn, better fencing, possibly a second corral. She talked about teaching, about how she missed it, about whether Caldwell might eventually need a second school teacher since the current school was apparently crowded enough that the children were sitting 3 to a bench. He listened, and she listened, and the talking was a kind of building, he thought. The way laying fence posts one at a time eventually produces a fence. The thing with Garfield Prout came to a head in the middle of November. Kate came to his door on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual, and her composure was intact, but only just. The way composure is when someone is holding it together through the effort of determination rather than ease. He brought her inside and sat her by the fire and said, "What has happened?" She told him. Prout had decided that the wage he had offered in his letter was, upon reflection, more than the work warranted. He had reduced it by a third without negotiation or notice, presenting the reduction as a statement of fact when he handed Kate her wages for the month. When Kate had objected, pointing out the terms of the written letter, Prout had said the letter was not a legal contract and that she was welcome to seek other employment if she preferred, but that she would need to find new lodging within the week because the room on his property was part of her employment arrangement. "He cannot do that," Timothy said, and the quietness of his voice was the particular quiet that comes before a decision rather than after an argument. "He believes he can," Kate said, "and practically speaking he is not entirely wrong. The law here is not particularly," she paused, looking for the fair word, "protective of employees, women employees particularly." "No," he said, "it is not." He looked at the fire for a moment. "What are you going to do?" She looked at him very directly. "I have been considering that question for the past 3 hours," she said. "I do not want to return to something I left behind. And I do not want to move on to another town and start this over again somewhere else." She paused. "There is something in Caldwell worth staying for." He looked at her and she looked at him, and they were both very well aware that they were talking about more than the town. "Stay here," he said. "Not for one night. Stay until you find a proper situation, a teaching position, something suitable. The second bedroom is there." She shook her head slowly. "Timothy, what would people say? I cannot simply move into a man's house who is not my—" "They can say what they like," he said, and then more carefully, because he did not want to say the next thing carelessly, he said, "Kate, I want to say something to you that I have been working toward for some time. I am not going to say it as a solution to a housing problem because I do not want you to think that is what it is. I would have said it regardless of Prout and his wages, but I want to say it now because I find I am tired of not saying it." He stopped and gathered himself the way you do when you are about to commit to something real. "I love you. I know it has only been a few months, and I know that is a large thing to say, and I am not saying it expecting anything in return except honesty. But I love you, Kate, and I want to marry you, and I am asking if that is something you want as well." She was very still. The fire crackled and the wind moved around the eaves of the house, and outside the November night was cold and enormous, and inside the house it was warm and lit and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "Timothy Doyle," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd Thursday. I have been trying to be sensible about it ever since." She paused. "I am very tired of being sensible about it." He crossed to where she was sitting and took both her hands and pulled her up from the chair, and they stood facing each other in the firelight, and she was looking at him with everything in her eyes and nothing held back, and he said, "Is that a yes?" "It is very much a yes," she said. He held her face in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that had no performance in it whatsoever, and she held on to him with both hands and kissed him back. And the second bedroom was just down the hallway with its yellow curtains and its good memory, and its new one being added. The wedding was planned for December. Timothy went to Reverend Moss the following morning with a directness that brooked no delay, and Reverend Moss, who had been watching the situation develop with the patient interest of a man who considers successful marriages a professional achievement, agreed to perform the ceremony on the 15th of December. In the meantime, there was the matter of Kate's immediate situation. She went back to Prout's ranch to collect her things and to give notice, and this conversation, which she conducted privately, she reported to Timothy afterward with a brevity that suggested Prout had been unpleasant about it. Timothy drove to the ranch with her to collect her trunk, and he got out of the wagon and waited on the road while she went inside for her things. and Prout came to the door of the main house and looked at him across the yard with the expression of a man who has just realized a calculation he was confident in has produced the wrong result. Timothy looked back at him without any particular animosity, but with the complete composure of a man who is entirely clear about what he is doing and why, and Prout went back inside. Kate's trunk was loaded into the wagon. They drove back to his homestead in the cold December air, and he carried the trunk into the house, and they stood in the hallway and he said, "The second bedroom is yours properly until we are married, and then it will be a spare room again." She looked at the door to the second bedroom. "You opened it for me," she said, meaning something larger than the literal act. "You gave me a reason to," he said. She reached out and opened the door and went inside and stood in the middle of the room with the yellow curtains at the windows and the afternoon winter light coming through them and turning everything faintly golden. "Tell me about Clara," she said. "Tell me about the curtains." He stood in the doorway and told her, simply and fully, how Clara had made them herself and hung them before the room was finished, and how pleased she had been with them. Kate listened, and then she said, "I think they are beautiful. I think she had excellent taste. And I think," she paused, choosing this carefully, "I think she would have wanted this room to be used again. I think she would have wanted you to be happy." "I believe that too," he said. "I have believed it for a while. It has taken me some time to act on it." Kate came to him in the doorway and put her arms around him and rested her head against his shoulder, and he held her there in the doorway of the yellow curtain room in the December afternoon, and thought about the remarkable geometry of life, the way the worst thing can become the foundation for the best thing if enough time passes and enough courage is applied. The town of Caldwell had opinions about the arrangement, because it always had opinions about everything, but the opinions were largely tempered by two factors. One was that Eleanor Moss, the Reverend's wife, made it publicly clear that she found Kate Brenner to be an entirely respectable young woman whose situation warranted a charitable and practical view, and what Eleanor Moss said about social matters was generally understood to be the final word. The other was that the engagement was announced immediately and the wedding was 2 weeks away, which reduced the scandal considerably, not to zero, because there was always someone willing to maintain a position against all practical argument, but to a murmur that was easy enough to step over. Timothy's friend Marcus Webb from the blacksmith served as best man, which Marcus accepted with a solemnity punctuated by a handshake that was essentially an embrace, and a comment about time being of the essence that Timothy chose not to elaborate on. Red Elk came into town for the wedding, which was notable, and sat in the back pew of the First Methodist Church with the quiet dignity of a man who has learned to navigate spaces that were not always gracious to him. And when the ceremony was over, Timothy made a point of bringing Kate directly to introduce her, and Kate extended her hand and said, "Timothy has told me that this house would not exist without your help. That means a great deal more than you might think." And Red Elk shook her hand and looked at her with an expression that suggested he was revising some expectations upward. The wedding itself was simple and real, and without the kind of theatrical elaboration that some Caldwell events seemed to require. Kate wore a dress of deep green wool, practical for December, beautiful for everything else, and Timothy wore his St. Louis jacket and the new shirt he had bought from Abernathy's specifically for the occasion, and had argued with Abernathy about the price of for 20 minutes, which Abernathy had found irritating and Timothy had found satisfying. They stood before Reverend Moss in the small, warm church on the 15th of December, 1883, and made their promises to each other with a steadiness and a sincerity that made Eleanor Moss, in the second pew, press her handkerchief to the corner of her eye. Timothy looked at Kate while she said her vows, and thought about the night in September when he had opened his door against the rain and found her there, and about how the entirety of what was happening on this December morning had come from that one act of practical hospitality extended, because a woman had a steady voice and green eyes, and the composure of someone who had been through real difficulty, and had come through it with her character intact. He thought about luck and about work, and about the way some things are given to you and some things you make, and the best things are usually both at once. He kissed his bride in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, Kansas on the 15th of December 1883, and it was the second time in his life he had kissed a woman he had married in a church, and the specific grace of it was not lost on him. The chance to stand in that moment again, to have been given the chance. They had a small gathering afterward at the homestead, Marcus and Red Elk and Eleanor Moss and a few other neighbors and friends. And Kate had prepared a remarkable quantity of food over the previous 2 days with what the Prout Ranch kitchen had taught her, and what the Doyle kitchen offered. And the house was warm and full of noise and laughter. And Timothy stood at the edge of the room and watched his wife move through it, laughing and talking, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 5 years. That night after everyone had gone home, he showed Kate their bedroom, properly now, the room that had been his alone, and the second bedroom down the hall was a spare room again, its yellow curtains and its good memories and its history belonging to the house rather than to grief, and that was exactly as it should be. Winter in Kansas has a particular character. It does not dally. It arrives with conviction and makes itself thoroughly at home and demands that you do the same. The prairie whitens and the creek beds freeze, and the sky turns a particular shade of pale gray that is not unbeautiful if you approach it correctly. Timothy and Kate Doyle approached their first winter together with the practical efficiency of 2 people who have both lived alone and know what winter requires, and the additional advantage of finding each other's company extremely good, which is what makes the difference between winter being something to endure and winter being something that is in fact quite fine. Kate took over the management of the household with a thoroughness that Timothy would have found overwhelming if it were not also so clearly an expression of satisfaction. She reorganized the kitchen with a logic that was immediately superior to what had been there before, began a correspondence with the school board about the possibility of a second teaching position, and started a kitchen garden plan for spring that she sketched out on paper over several evenings by the fire while Timothy read or worked on equipment repairs at the table. She was interested in everything and opinionated about most of it, and he found this endlessly engaging, the way a good conversation is engaging when you are talking to someone who takes thinking seriously. They talked about children, not with anxiety or pressure, but with the naturalness of 2 people who have chosen a life together and are curious about what that life will contain. Kate wanted children. She said so directly, because she said most things directly. She had wanted them with Frank, and it had not happened before he died, and she had accepted this without self-pity but with a quiet sadness that she was honest about. Timothy wanted children also, which he said with equal directness, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table on a February evening with the fire high and the snow falling outside, and the shared understanding that they were building something together that had all the room in the world. Spring came in March, as it does in Kansas, tentatively and then all at once, the snow retreating and the ground softening and the prairie beginning to green from the inside out, and Kate Doyle got her position as assistant schoolteacher at the Caldwell school, which she announced to Timothy at dinner one evening in April with the contained excitement of someone who has been very carefully not getting her hopes up. And he looked at her and said, "Of course you did." And she threw a dinner roll at him with great accuracy. And he caught it, and she laughed her surprised laugh, and he thought that this was what he had been afraid he would never have again, something as simple and specific as this. She was a remarkable teacher. He heard this from the parents of her students, who told him at the general store or after church, with the earnest appreciation of people who had noticed a genuine improvement in their children's engagement with learning. She taught with energy and without condescension. She took the older students especially seriously, and she managed the three-a-bench overcrowding situation by reorganizing the room with a furniture geometry that the previous teacher had apparently not attempted. She came home in the afternoons bright with it, full of something that had been fed. The baby came in January of 1885. It was a boy, and they named him James after Timothy's father. He came into the world in the second bedroom of the homestead on a cold January morning, with the yellow curtains bright in the winter light. The birth attended by Mrs. Eleanor Moss, who had trained as a midwife before she was a preacher's wife, and who managed the whole event with the calm authority of someone who has done difficult things many times and has learned that competence is the most genuine form of reassurance. Timothy waited in the main room during the birth, which was the custom of the time and which he found a very poor custom, and paced the length of the room approximately 60 times, and when Eleanor Moss came out and said, "You have a son, Mr. Doyle, and your wife is well," he sat down very suddenly in his chair and put his face in his hands for a moment that was not grief at all. He went into the second bedroom, and Kate was in the iron bed with her dark hair loose, and her face exhausted and incandescent, and she held the baby in her arms and looked at Timothy when he came in with an expression he knew he would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of his life. "James," she said, "come and meet your father." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son for the first time in the room where the yellow curtains were, in the room that had been closed for 5 years and opened for one night and never closed again. And he thought about everything that had led to this, and found that it was not a thought he could quite contain, not because it was sad but because it was too full. "He looks like you," Kate said. "He looks like a very small and rather opinionated person," Timothy said, and she laughed, softly because she was tired, and the baby made a small sound of protest at the noise, and they both looked at him with the specific wonder that new parents have, which does not need description because everyone who has experienced it knows exactly what it is. James Doyle was a healthy and vigorous baby who expressed his opinions loudly and frequently, which his father found amusing and his mother found familiar. He grew with the determination that good Kansas soil and a warm house and 2 devoted parents produces, and the homestead expanded around him, the second bedroom becoming the nursery. A third bedroom added to the house in the summer of 1885, when Timothy spent 2 months framing and completing it with Red Elk's help. The two of them worked on it in the long summer evenings after the day's work was done, and Kate brought them cold water and sometimes sat on the half-finished porch and read to them while they worked, which Red Elk said was the best working arrangement he had encountered in considerable experience. Marcus Webb married a woman from Wichita in the spring of 1885, a capable and forthright woman named Helen who approved of Kate immediately, and with whom Kate formed a friendship that was the fast, uncomplicated kind that both of them had apparently been waiting for, and the 4 of them, Timothy, Kate, Marcus, Helen, made up a social circle that was easy and honest, and involved a great deal of food and occasional card games, and the kind of conversation that goes late into the evening without anyone noticing the time. The school board in Caldwell gave Kate her own classroom in 1886, which was a recognition of what everyone who had a child in the school already knew, and she accepted it with the same quality of contained satisfaction she had shown when the first appointment came through, and then went home and allowed herself to be entirely pleased about it, which Timothy watched with great enjoyment. Garfield Prout died in the autumn of 1886 of a heart complaint that had been building for years, and his ranch was sold in pieces to several buyers, and nobody in Caldwell spent very long on the subject. The world moved on the way it always does, practical and without pause. The second baby came in 1887. Another boy, whom they named Patrick after Kate's grandfather, and he arrived into the world with considerably less drama than James had, which Kate said indicated good character and Timothy said indicated that James had used up the available drama allotment for the family for the foreseeable future. And James, who was 2 years old and already had opinions, objected to both interpretations. The homestead in those years had the quality of a place that is fully inhabited, not just lived in but actively loved, the way houses become when people are happy in them. Timothy built a proper barn in the summer of 1887 and expanded the kitchen in the spring of 1888, framing it out and finishing it with cedar planks that Kate had insisted on because she had seen cedar kitchen walls in a catalog and thought they were beautiful, and she was right. The cattle operation expanded modestly, enough to generate solid income, not so much that it consumed everything, and Kate's teaching income made the difference that meant they could do things like the cedar kitchen without it being a strain. The third child came in 1889, a girl this time, born in the new November, and they named her Clara. It had been Kate's idea. She had brought it up one evening in late summer when she was very pregnant and they were sitting on the porch watching the stars, and she had said, "Timothy, I want to ask you something and I want you to say exactly what you think." He had said, "I always say what I think, more or less." "More or less," she said with the corner of her mouth. "I have been thinking about names. If it is a girl, I would like to name her Clara, if you are comfortable with that." He had been quiet for a moment. Not because the idea troubled him, but because it moved him in a way that required a moment. "It is not meant to be melancholy," Kate said carefully. "It is meant to be an honoring. She was part of your life and this house, and I find I think about her sometimes, not with jealousy, but with something more like gratitude. She loved you well enough that you are the person I fell in love with. That matters." He had taken her hand and held it and said, "Clara is a very good name." And so the baby girl born in November of 1889 was Clara Doyle, and she had her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, and from the earliest age a temperament that was simultaneously decisive and warm, which was a combination she had apparently inherited from both sides, and she was completely delightful. James grew into a thoughtful, serious boy who read everything he could find and helped his father with the cattle with a competence that developed steadily and without drama. Patrick grew into a boy who was fundamentally happy, interested in everything, generally found in the middle of whatever was most interesting, and constitutionally incapable of being defeated by a difficulty for more than about 20 minutes before approaching it from a different angle. Clara grew into her name in the way that some children grow into their names, as though the name recognized something about them before they fully became it. Timothy watched his family and worked his land and thought sometimes about the night in September 1883 when he had stood at his front door and opened it against the rain and found a woman with green eyes and a traveling bag standing on his porch, soaked through and steady, asking for one night's lodging. He thought about what he had almost done, which was hesitate and say he did not have a spare room, which would have been true in every sense that mattered and entirely false in every sense that actually did. He had opened the door and opened the room and opened, though he had not known it yet, everything else. In the spring of 1890, Kate was offered the position of head schoolteacher at the Caldwell school, which was the full recognition of 7 years of work, and she accepted it and celebrated it properly, which meant that evening Timothy made the special occasion dinner of roasted chicken and cornbread and apple pie that had become their tradition for the things worth marking. And the children all participated in the celebration with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of children who live in a house where good things are treated as occasions. "You are a remarkable woman, Kate Doyle," Timothy said, across the table. "You are not bad yourself, Timothy Doyle," she said. James said, "Can I have more pie?" And the moment expanded to include him, and Patrick knocked over his cup, and Clara laughed at the noise, and the kitchen was full of it all. And outside the Kansas Spring was doing what the Kansas Spring does in April, showing off, going extravagantly green under a sky that was the clearest blue available. Red Elk came through that spring with his nephew Thomas, who was now 27, and who had married a woman from his own community and had 2 children and a settled life. And they visited for an afternoon and ate dinner, and there was a warmth to the evening that had always characterized Red Elk's visits, the warmth that comes from genuine regard that has been maintained over time. Red Elk looked at the house, expanded now, with the cedar kitchen and the third bedroom and the good barn, and he said to Timothy, "You have built something worth building," which from Red Elk was a great deal, being a man who chose his words as carefully as his materials. Timothy showed him the barn and they talked about the changes in the territory, because the changes were considerable. The Kishom Trail was essentially finished, the railroad had taken its business, and Caldwell was finding a new identity with less drama and more agriculture than its cattle town years had offered. It was a different place than the one Timothy had arrived in 6 years prior, quieter in some ways and more settled, and he found he liked the settled version as well as the wild one, which perhaps said something about where he was in his own life. Kate came out of the house to join them with coffee and 3 cups, and she sat on the porch steps with Red Elk and they talked about the school and about the ways the territory was changing. And Timothy watched them and thought about the conversation they had once had about the injustices that were threaded through all of it. The fact that the land he farmed had been someone else's before he arrived, and before the cattlemen arrived and before all of it. And the fact that the people it had belonged to were now compressed into territories that bore little relationship to what they had had. Red Elk did not speak of this with bitterness, generally, but with a directness that Timothy respected, and that Kate met with the same directness, acknowledging it plainly rather than looking away from it, and this was one of the things he loved most about her. The summer of 1890 brought a dry spell that lasted 6 weeks and strained the cattle and the kitchen garden alike, and the community of Caldwell pulled together in the practical way of people who understand that the land is the great leveler, that it does not care about your social position or your opinions about other people's domestic arrangements. And the families shared water from wells that were still running and helped each other get cattle to shade and traded vegetables from the parts of gardens that had survived. Timothy and Kate gave as much as they had and received what they needed, and it was in these times particularly that Timothy felt the rightness of being embedded in a community, something he had not fully appreciated when he lived in it alone. Marcus and Helen Webb had a daughter that summer, born in August in the middle of the heat, and named Emily, and she was immediately adopted by the collective affection of both families and grew up alongside the Doyle children as comfortably as a cousin. Emily had her mother's forthright manner and her father's ability to work iron, which became apparent early and was encouraged enthusiastically by everyone involved. The autumn rains came eventually, and the dry spell broke and the prairie recovered the way prairie always does, with a thoroughness that is almost arrogant. The Doyle homestead came through the summer with its cattle reduced but intact, and its kitchen garden ragged but functional and its family entirely undiminished. On an October evening in 1890, 7 years almost to the month from Kate's first arrival at his door, Timothy and Kate sat on the porch of their house in the early evening and watched the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and rose and gold that were, as always in Kansas, excessive in the best possible way. The children were inside, James doing the reading he would not admit he found pleasurable because he had decided at 9 years old that he was past being enthusiastic about things openly. Patrick building something out of wood scraps with great determination and no clear plan. Clara asleep already because she had decided at dinner that she was not sleepy, and had demonstrated the opposite within 20 minutes of making this declaration. The evening air smelled of dry grass and the last of the summer's heat, and something cool underneath it that was the beginning of autumn's real intention. "What are you thinking about?" Kate said. He looked at her. She was 32 years old, and she was beautiful in the October light with the gray just beginning at her temples that she did not disguise because she said there was nothing to disguise, and her green eyes were on the sunset and then on him. 7 years ago this month," he said, "you knocked on my door." "I did," she said. "In the rain." "In the rain," he agreed, and asked if you could stay one night. I was hoping for a dry floor and a roof, she said. I was not expecting all of this. What were you expecting? He said. She thought about it. A decent man with a spare room, she said. That is what Mrs. Hatch described. She was not wrong. High praise, he said. It was enough, she said, smiling. It was more than enough, as it turned out. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the ease of 7 years and the warmth of 100,000 moments accumulated, and they watched the sunset over the Kansas prairie while inside their children were alive and busy in theirs. I would like another child, Kate said casually into the sunset. He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon with an expression of deliberate innocence. Would you? He said. I have been thinking about it, she said. The house is larger now. We have the room. We have the room, he agreed. And 3 children is a very respectable number, she said. But 4 has a kind of completeness to it that I find appealing. He laughed, which startled a bird out of the cottonwood at the edge of the yard. I find it appealing as well, he said. She looked at him and she was smiling, that surprised, genuine smile that had been surprising him for 7 years and still did. And he kissed her temple in the evening light, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. Inside the house, Patrick dropped whatever he was building, and it made a tremendous noise, and James said something in the tone of a person who has been interrupted. And Clara did not wake, but made a small sound in her sleep that was either a dream or an opinion, and the house was full of all of it. The 4th child came in August of 1891, the very middle of the Kansas summer, another boy, whom they named Daniel, and he arrived in the world with the particular conviction of someone who has thought carefully about being here and decided it suits them. He was a warm, easy baby who slept at reasonable hours and ate with enthusiasm, and regarded his siblings with an unflappable good nature that was either his own character or the result of being born into a house so full of personality that an additional temperament had nowhere left to go but peaceful. Clara, at nearly 2 years old, found Daniel fascinating and slightly alarming, and approached him with the combination of scientific interest and proprietary concern that the youngest child promoted to second youngest generally develops. The homestead settled into the rhythms of 4 children and 2 people who loved each other, and the work that sustained it all. Timothy continued to improve the property in the methodical way that was his nature, and Kate continued to teach at the Caldwell school, with the reputation that had grown over the years into something the town took genuine pride in. There were families in Caldwell who had moved there specifically because of the school, which meant specifically because of Kate Doyle, a fact that she acknowledged with a characteristic modesty that her husband found both admirable and mildly exasperating. In the winter of 1892, the school board, after a formal petition signed by 17 families and presented at the town meeting, voted to build a larger schoolhouse on the east side of Caldwell with 2 separate classrooms and a proper library room, which was Kate's specification, and which the board had initially resisted, and then agreed to because Kate Doyle was not someone whose specifications were easily set aside. Timothy built 3 of the bookshelves for the library room himself, cutting them from good pine and finishing them with linseed oil. And when the school opened in the spring of 1893, and Kate stood in the library room with the shelves full of donated and purchased books, and the children filing in to see it for the first time, she turned to him where he was standing in the doorway, and her face had the expression she wore when she was too pleased to contain it. And he had never seen anything that pleased him more. The years moved the way good years do, full and fast, and with the particular quality of time that is loved while it is happening rather than only in retrospect. James, at 12, began helping with the cattle in earnest and revealed a gift for it that was natural and unassuming. Patrick, at 10, built things constantly and increasingly well. Clara, at 7, read everything and argued with everyone about it and was clearly going to be a teacher or a lawyer or possibly both. Daniel, at 4, was universally beloved, and had developed the diplomatic instinct of someone who has learned early that the way to navigate between three older siblings is to be pleasant to all of them. Timothy was 43 in 1895 and Kate was 37, and they sat on the porch one October evening exactly 12 years from when she had first arrived, and he thought that there was almost no way to say it adequately, what the 12 years had contained, so he did not try to say it adequately. He simply said, "I am glad you knocked on my door." She turned from watching the sunset and looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which after 12 years still had the same quality, still made him feel specifically seen in the way that the best kind of love does. "So am I," she said, "though I will say it was not the easiest door to find." "You live a considerable distance from town." "I do," he said. "Mrs. Hatch gave you good directions." "She did," Kate said. "She told me to take the east road and look for the house with the light on the porch." "I always left the porch light on," he said, "even when there was no one to come home to." She was quiet for a moment. "You were keeping it on for someone," she said. "You just did not know yet who it was for." He looked at her. This woman who had arrived on his porch in September rain and asked for one night and stayed for every night after that. This woman who had brought back the yellow curtain room and the laughter in the house, and the shape that a life needs to be fully a life. "I suppose I was," he said. She put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his palm up and held her hand, and they watched the Kansas evening come on, the stars appearing one by one in the enormous sky. And inside the house, Daniel was telling a story to Clara about something that had happened at school, and Patrick was sawing something, and James was reading to himself with the slightly too loud quiet of someone who is deeply absorbed, and the fire was going in the hearth, and the cedar kitchen was warm. And the yellow curtains were in the second bedroom, which was the children's room now. The curtains Clara had named her room after because she liked how the light came through them in the morning and turned everything gold. The porch light was on, the same as always. The Kansas night came in full and great and star-filled, and the prairie breathed around the house, and Timothy Doyle held his wife's hand in the dark and knew that he was precisely where he was supposed to be, which is the thing that only some people get to know, and which is the most valuable knowledge there is. In the years that followed, when people asked Kate Doyle how she had come to Caldwell, she told the story plainly and without embellishment because the plain version was remarkable enough. She had arrived on a stage in the rain with nowhere to sleep, and had knocked on the door of a man she had never met because a woman at the general store had described him as decent. He had been exactly that, decent, which was a word that sounded small until you understood what it actually encompassed, which was everything. And Timothy Doyle, when asked how it had come about, said simply that he had opened a door he had good reason to open, and it had led to everything he had thereafter. Which was the truth as far as it went, though the fuller truth was that it had led to Kate, and Kate had led to all the rest, and all the rest was the life, the whole and complete and fully inhabited life, that he could not imagine now having not lived. The second bedroom with its yellow curtains had been closed for 5 years and opened for one night. That had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything.